Hey everyone. Today I want to talk about this new approach to creativity that I've been utilizing and writing about that I think you could benefit from if you do creative things. So if you're a writer, a painter, an illustrator, if you make YouTube videos, if you're a programmer, a musician, anytime you are trying to create something new, a new song, a new blog post, a new work of art, this is a sort of approach to creativity I've been playing with lately that I learned or sort of started utilizing after I took this great songwriting course with one of my favorite songwriters, Scott McMicken. He's in the band Dr. Dog, which is one of my favorite bands. It was this songwriting course put on by a company called School of Song, so if you're into songwriting and music, check them out. Basically, they have people who are in bands or successful musicians come and teach these month-long classes. I know Robin Pecknold of Fleet Foxes did one, that's how I learned about it, and then Scott just did this one. They've had Dave Longstreth from Dirty Projectors do one. A lot of cool people, Buck Meek I think did one. Anyway, one of the first things Scott said in that class was the benefit of having something to respond to as a creative person rather than starting from scratch. So if you think about, like, in the context of writers, there's this whole big scary concept of writer's block. And it's the idea of you want to create a new piece of writing, but you don't know where to start and you can't get your ideas out. And sort of the traditional advice around that from professional writers like Stephen King is basically write through the shitty drafts and accept that your first takes are going to be shitty and then work on making it better through iteration. And this kind of is related to that, but it's a little more literal or a little bit of a different approach. Instead of starting with a blank Word document for writers, or just sitting with your guitar with no ideas as a musician, or, you know, an empty IDE if you're a programmer, blank canvas if you're a painter, whatever it is. Instead of starting with that blank working space, start with something to creatively respond to. And so that could be an image, that could be a newspaper article, a single sentence from a story or the newspaper. It could be a single word even. Chords. It could be starting with a sort of progression. Whatever it is, start with something to be your creative spark or your creative seed, and start responding to that as an artist with your own creative instincts and sensibilities. So the example that kicked this off in the class with Scott was the assignment was to write a song about the moon. That was our first week assignment. And so ordinarily, you know, you go to write a new song and you're like, I don't really know what to sing about, I don't have any ideas. You just sort of mess around and see what happens. But if you're not feeling motivated, it can be tough. And Scott's approach was like, just get something going and see what comes later. And build that scaffolding up as quick as possible so that you can start getting structure and getting something defined. And so with writing a song about the moon, that week I didn't start with that frustration of reaching and trying to pull something out of nothing and that almost infinite landscape of possibilities when you're trying to create something. I started with, okay, I know I'm writing a song about the moon this week. And so my creative instinct tends to be like compilation and looking at other works and trying to get inspired that way. And so I built a whole playlist of a bunch of songs about the moon that I love, like Harvest Moon from Neil Young, Here Comes the Moon by George Harrison, and just a bunch of songs about the moon. And I just started listening to them and thinking about, you know, what do I think about the moon? What are some of the first associations I have when I think about the moon? And I had a really enjoyable experience and almost an effortless experience writing this song about the moon, which is up on YouTube. And because I already knew that theme, all I had to do was execute in the way that aligned with my creative sensibilities. I didn't have to come up with every single aspect of the thing from scratch, and it was a lot easier to iterate in real time since I already knew what that prompt was that I would respond to. I remember one of the first experiences I had with this approach to work was in elementary school, actually. I had this teacher who brought in a huge stack of these photographs. They were all black and white photographs. And at first they just appeared like normal photographs, but when one by one we went up and we were told for each of us to pick one photograph and take it back to your desk. And I grabbed the one that appealed to me. It was this black and white photograph of a long city avenue, like New York or Chicago or something. It's a beautiful black and white photo, but when you look at it, and when I looked at it as like a third or fourth grader, I noticed it was almost a normal photo, except coming down the avenue, way in the background of the photo, was a giant steamship, like, you know, the Titanic or something. So it had these tall, like, coal stacks, and so it was sort of these surrealist photos. I remember another one I almost picked was this living room that looked just like a normal suburban living room, but all these birds were flying out of the chimney into the living room. And so there were these weird photographs, and we had to write a short story based on the photograph. And I still remember that to this day, and it was one of the more enjoyable assignments I had as a school child. And so that's the power of these prompts, right? And I think working in this way tends to be a lot more enjoyable, because all you have to do is give your honest opinion to that prompt and seed you're starting with. Like, if you think about it, most people, whether they actively make art or not, are pretty good or find it easy to give critiques, to be the critic, right? There's the whole idea it's easier to be the critic than the creator. Like that quote about what matters is the man in the arena rather than, you know, the critics in the stands. And it's true, like, if you just walked around outside with a piece of art, it doesn't matter, it could be one of the most famous artists of all time, people will have an opinion about it, and they can tell you specific things that they do or don't like about that piece of art. But if you just told people, make a piece of art that represents what you love about art, execution aside, because most people aren't practiced and can't create a piece of beautiful art on the fly, but putting that aside, most people would still have a harder time generating and expressing what they love creatively when starting from a blank canvas. Because it's a lot easier when you have things, raw material to respond to and comment on, than it is to start from nothing and channel that through and articulate it well. So that shows the power of this prompting thing. If you are a songwriter and you're interested in this, following the class, I spun up a new Substack. It's called Pocket Prompts. So if you go to pocketprompts.substack.com, I'll link it below too, you can subscribe for this newsletter. And basically every Monday, once a week, I send out one songwriting prompt. And we've had kind of a cool community building up from it. I think there's like 60 or 70 people now signing up and getting these in their inbox once a week. And it's a really cool exercise. I think we've done songs about birds, that was this week's. We've done songs about beginnings, firsts, or the number one. We've done a Valentine's Day song, so songs with arrow, chocolate, flower imagery, that kind of thing. And it's been really cool and very fruitful, and I've been enjoying working in this way a lot recently. So yeah, if you're a creative person, I highly encourage you sort of building up a stash of notes. And if you make YouTube videos, keep a list of all your YouTube ideas when they randomly come to you. And what you're doing is you're building a stash up for future you to respond to creatively. So let's take the example of the YouTuber. I'm not saying that having a list of ideas is useful just because you can go to that list when you don't have an idea and pick one, although that certainly can be helpful. But when you go back to the list, what I find is over time, you kind of forget the specific context around why you added something, especially if you play with your future self a little bit by deliberately being a little bit vague in your notes. And then what happens is your present day self is reinterpreting what your past self wrote. And that can create something novel and creative. So you see a note from your past self and you're like, I'm not really sure what I meant by that, but here's how I'm going to interpret it with my present experiences and my present mindset. And you can kind of create this future stash of creative seeds and sparks for your future self. Because this is kind of the broader insight of this way of working that I've stumbled into. it really is what creativity in general is. What we do is we take in the raw material and input of the world and we interpret it through our own unique lens and perspective creatively. But when you're not as literal and deliberate as giving yourself a word, a sentence, a theme, a progression of chords, it's a lot harder to articulate yourself because you haven't digested the input of the world yet and you haven't literalized it for yourself to make it easier to respond to. In the same way we talked about showing a piece of art to people on the street, you haven't shown yourself that piece of art even though you're taking in data from the world all the time. So by literalizing it and giving yourself an actual prompt to respond to, you can say, I don't like this, I do like this, let's go more in that direction, more in that direction, I would tweak this, I like that name, what do I like about that name? Okay, here's what I like. And you create this whole fertile ground for creativity when you work that way. So I highly encourage you try it no matter what creative domain you are working in. I think it's really powerful. And it may seem a little obvious, but just be literal about it and try it. It can be clunky at first, but adapt as needed. And it's something I've really been enjoying. So appreciate you watching, and I'll see you later. See ya. Thanks.